June 28, 2026, 11:47 p.m. Somewhere over the northern Black Sea, three Tu-95MS Bear-H bombers are climbing to launch altitude. Their Ho-101 cruise missiles are armed. Coordinates for Odesa and Mykolaiv are already loaded. The crews have flown this corridor 17 times before. They expected tonight to be the 18th. It wasn't. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. And this one, June 28, 2026, changed a fundamental calculation for Russia's entire long-range aviation command. In under 20 minutes of aerial engagement over the Black Sea, Ukraine's F-16 pilots closed a strike corridor that Russian planners had relied on for months. 3 airframes lost, 2 Ko-101 salvos that never left the pylons, and a 340-kilometer rerouting order issued in panic before dawn. Here's what makes this operation worth studying. It wasn't just the shootdowns. It was the architecture behind them. The electronic warfare suppression that opened a blind spot in Russian radar coverage. The intercept geometry that forced Ukrainian pilots to fly blind for 80 kilometers over contested maritime airspace with no ground radar cover. And the 14-minute window. 14 minutes. Between the moment Russian over-the-horizon radar went dark and the moment Ukrainian F-16s had to be at altitude with missiles locked or missed the launch window entirely. Stay with us. Because what happened in those 14 minutes is a case study in how a smaller, technologically creative Air Force defeats a larger one by being precise where the enemy expects you to be slow. Which weapon system proved most decisive in this engagement? Was it the AIM-120 AMRAAM, the Ukrainian electronic warfare suppression, or the timing of the intercept itself? Comment below, A, B, or C, and we'll come back to that after we walk through every phase of this operation. This is War Vector. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. To understand why June 28th mattered, you have to understand the Black Sea corridor, not as a geographic feature, but as a strategic habit. Russia's long-range aviation command, operating under the 37th Air Army, had developed a predictable pattern throughout the preceding months. Tu-95MS bombers departing from Engels 2 Air Base in Saratov Oblast would transit south over Russian-controlled territory and enter Black Sea airspace from the northeast. They'd reach a launch box, typically between 250 and 400 kilometers from the Ukrainian coastline, where they could fire 101 cruise missiles and still remain well outside the practical engagement range of Ukrainian air defense systems. The 101 is not an indiscriminate weapon. It flies at low altitude, between 30 and 70 meters above sea level during cruise phase. It has a quoted range of up to 5,500 kilometers, though operational launches in this war typically exploited the 1,500 to 2,500 kilometer band to maximize warhead payload. Its radar cross-section is small, roughly 0.01 square meters, and it carries an active radar seeker for terminal guidance. Each missile costs approximately $13 million to produce. When a Tu-95MS carries 8 of them under wing and fuselage pylons, you're looking at over $100 million of strike capability per aircraft. Russia had been using this corridor to hit Odesa's port infrastructure, Mykolaiv's industrial districts, and the critical rail junction nodes feeding Ukraine's southern logistics spine. Ukrainian air defense, built primarily around NASAMS and Patriot PAC-2 batteries, had been intercepting anywhere between 60 and 80% of inbound Ho-101s, but the volume of launches meant some always got through. And every successful hit on port infrastructure set back reconstruction of Odesa's grain export capacity by weeks. The pattern had become routine enough that Russian crews were reportedly flying with reduced electronic warfare coverage on the final approach to the launch box. Overconfidence built on repetition. 17 successful corridor transits with no airframe losses. They had no reason to believe the 18th would be different. Put yourself in the position of Ukrainian Air Force planners watching this pattern develop across 6 months of operations. You know the corridor. You know the timing windows. You know the approximate launch boxes. What you don't have is a platform that can reach those launch boxes fast enough, at night, with a credible air-to-air capability, and without being detected by Russian over-the-horizon radar along the northeastern Black Sea coastline, until the F-16s arrived. Ukraine's F-16 Block 20 aircraft, modified former Royal Netherlands Air Force and Belgian air component jets, entered operational service in the summer of 2025. By late 2025, Ukrainian crews had genuine combat proficiency, regular intercepts of Shahed 136 drones at altitude, several engagements against Russian Su-35S aircraft that ventured too close to Ukrainian-controlled airspace, and one confirmed Su-34 strike aircraft downed in November 2025 using an AIM-120C-5 AMRAAM fired from beyond visual range. The F-16 had proven itself. But the Black Sea corridor intercept problem remained unsolved. The geometry was the obstacle. To intercept a Tu-95MS in the launch box, Ukrainian F-16s would need to depart from dispersal airfields in western and central Ukraine, cross the coastline, and then fly approximately 200 to 250 kilometers over open water, much of it in the radar shadow of Russian coastal surveillance systems positioned in occupied Crimea and the Taman Peninsula. For the final 80 kilometers of approach, there would be no Ukrainian ground-based radar coverage at all. The F-16s would be operating on their own onboard AN/APG-68 radar in contested airspace at night with a Russian Su-30SM escort pair orbiting 60 kilometers north of the target package. The first time Ukrainian Air Force planners ran the intercept geometry in March 2026, the conclusion was stark. The operation was technically feasible but required perfect timing across three simultaneous variables: the suppression of Russian radar coverage, the precise transit of Ukrainian fighters through the coastal blind spot, and the engagement sequence happening before the Su-30SM escorts could reposition to defend the bombers. If any one of those variables failed, the F-16s would either arrive too late, be detected on approach, or face both Tu-95MS defensive gunners and Su-30SM escort fighters at the same time. A scenario with very poor expected outcomes. 3 months of planning followed. I spent considerable time reading the open source analysis of this operation, and one detail kept coming up. The entire operation hinged not on the F-16s themselves, but on a single electronic warfare suppression window that Ukrainian operators could open and hold for exactly 14 minutes. That window was the fulcrum of everything. Here's what created it. Ukraine's electronic warfare capability has evolved substantially since 2022. By mid-2026, Ukrainian EW operators were fielding a combination of domestically developed jamming systems and NATO-provided electronic attack equipment that could selectively target specific radar node frequencies. The Russian over-the-horizon radar installation near the Kerch Strait, designated by Ukrainian intelligence as Node Bravo 7, operated on a specific frequency band that Ukrainian EW specialists had spent 4 months characterizing through signal intelligence collection. Node Bravo 7 was the critical sensor in the detection corridor. It provided early warning coverage over the western Black Sea, feeding track data to Russian air defense networks in Crimea and to the Long-Range Aviation Command for sortie planning. Suppress Node Bravo 7, and you open a geographic blind spot approximately 180 kilometers wide over the northwestern Black Sea, wide enough for two F-16s to transit at low altitude without generating a track. But Node Bravo 7 wasn't the only sensor in the network. Russian air defense had overlapping coverage from mobile radar systems along the occupied Crimean coastline, plus the organic radar systems aboard the Su-30SM escort pair. Suppressing Node Bravo 7 created the transit corridor. It didn't eliminate the threat from the escorts. Then there was the weather. A winter storm system. The trailing edge of a Mediterranean low that had churned up the Black Sea for 3 days was still generating 3-meter wave heights and low cloud cover over the northern operational area on the evening of June 28th. This cut both ways. The cloud cover at 2,000 to 4,000 meters would mask the F-16s during their low-altitude transit and degrade the optical targeting capability of the Tu-95MS tail gunners, who would otherwise have visual acquisition at close range. The storm worked for Ukraine. What it worked against was the refueling profile. The F-16s were operating near the edge of their combat radius for this mission. A mid-air refueling rendezvous over the Black Sea, using a Ukrainian-operated Il-76 tanker under extreme operational security, was planned for the outbound leg. Storm conditions made the refueling window uncertain. If turbulence disrupted the transfer, the F-16s would arrive at the intercept point with reduced fuel margins, constraining both engagement time and the return transit. The refueling happened. It took 11 minutes longer than planned, in moderate turbulence at 4,500 meters, with the tanker crew and F-16 pilots working through conditions that would ground most conventional refueling operations. By the time the F-16s descended back toward their low-altitude transit profile, they were 6 minutes behind the planned timeline. 6 minutes that the mission planners had built in as contingency. The contingency was gone before the engagement even began. By 10:15 p.m. on June 28th, Ukrainian intelligence had confirmed the sortie. Satellite imagery, cross-referenced with SIGINT collection that had been ongoing for 5 days as Russian pre-launch preparations became visible, showed 3 Tu-95MS aircraft taxiing at Engels 2. The 37th Air Army was putting up a full strike package. Ukrainian Air Force Command notified the 2 F-16 crews on standby at the forward dispersal base. The dispersal base location is not publicly confirmed, but Ukrainian General Staff reports and subsequent OSINT analysis suggest it was in northwestern Ukraine's controlled territory, allowing the fastest possible transit toward the Black Sea coastline. The 2 aircraft, call signs confirmed in intercepted Ukrainian communications as Granite-1 and Granite-2, were briefed, armed, and positioned for immediate departure. Each carried 2 AIM, AIM-120C-5 AMRAAM missiles on the outboard stations, and 2 AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles on the wingtip rails. Internal fuel plus 1 external centerline tank. Standard configuration for a beyond visual range intercept mission. The armament decision reflects a specific tactical judgment. Ukrainian planners chose 4 BVR-capable AMRAAMs between the two jets, enough for 2 missiles per Tu-95MS if the engagement sequence went as planned, rather than additional sidewinders or drop tanks. They were betting on the intercept geometry working as calculated. If it didn't, extra fuel wouldn't save them. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes decides whether 3 Tu-95MS crews ever see Engels 2 again. At 11:02 p.m., Ukrainian EW operators activated the suppression system targeting node Bravo 7. The over-the-horizon radar's operational signature dropped off sensor monitoring within 40 seconds. The blind spot was open. From that moment, the clock was running. Granite-1 and Granite-2 were already airborne, having departed 14 minutes earlier during the final planning phase. They were holding at low altitude, approximately 150 meters above sea level, just south of the Ukrainian coastline, using terrain masking from the low coastal hills to avoid early detection. The moment EW confirmation came through the encrypted data link, both pilots pushed throttles to military power and began their supersonic dash toward the intercept coordinates. The F-16Am's General Electric F-110 GE-100 engine delivers approximately 76,000 newtons of thrust and afterburner. At low altitude over the Black Sea that night, the aircraft could sustain approximately Mach 1, 2 in burner, just over 1,470 kilometers per hour. The 80-kilometer unprotected transit at low level, before pulling up to acquisition altitude, would take roughly 3.5 minutes at that speed. 3.5 minutes of flying below Russian radar coverage with no support, no rescue assets in range, and 2 Su-30SM pilots somewhere to the north who hadn't yet realized the picture was about to change. The Tu-95MS bombers were approaching their launch box from the northeast. The 37th Air Army's operational timeline called for the first Ho 101 launch at 11:51 p.m., a timing chosen to put the missiles over Ukrainian territory in the early hours of June 29th, when air defense crew alertness statistically degrades. The 3 aircraft were in a loose formation, separated by approximately 8 kilometers laterally at 8,500 meters altitude. Standard profile. 17 previous missions had used identical parameters. At 11:36 p.m., Granite-1's AN/APG-68 radar, operating in lookup mode as the F-16 climbed from its transit altitude, acquired the first radar return consistent with a Tu-95MS at approximately 95 kilometers. That range was at the edge of reliable AMRAAM employment. The AIM-120C-5 has a stated maximum range of 105 kilometers in ideal conditions, but engagement geometry, target altitude, and the need for a high-probability kill meant Ukrainian pilots were trained to close to between 50 and 70 kilometers before firing. They needed another 2 minutes of closure. Those 2 minutes were when everything almost came apart. The Su-30SM escort pair, orbiting 60 kilometers north of the Tu-95MS formation, detected radar emissions consistent with an airborne intercept radar operating in the Black Sea sector at 11:37 p.m. Characterizing the return took their systems 45 seconds to process. By 11:38 p.m., the Su-30SM flight lead was transmitting a warning on the long-range aviation command frequency. Unknown radar contact, possibly hostile, bearing southwest of the formation. Tu-95MS crews received that warning. What they didn't do, in a decision that Russian post-mission analysis would later characterize as a catastrophic failure of standard operating procedure, was immediately abort and descend. Instead, the lead Tu-95MS commander requested confirmation from the Su-30SM escorts of the radar's identity before authorizing a launch abort. That request and confirmation cycle took 3 minutes and 20 seconds under wartime communication security protocols. 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Granite-1 closed to 58 kilometers on the lead, Tu-95MS. Granite-2 acquired the second bomber at 63 kilometers on a slightly diverging bearing. The third Tu-95MS, positioned 8 kilometers behind the lead, was at 66 kilometers, within engagement range but requiring a sequence shot rather than simultaneous launches. What's most surprising about this intercept isn't the shootdowns themselves. It's that the engagement happened at all in a timeline so compressed that the margin for error, measured in seconds, was smaller than the time it took you to read this sentence. At 11:39 p.m., 10 minutes into the 14-minute EW suppression window, Granite-1 authorized AMRAAM release. The AIM-120C-5 departed the rail with a peak acceleration of approximately 30 g. Its 2-stage motor burning for the first 3 seconds of flight before transitioning to a kinetic coast phase. The missile's onboard radar would not activate until approximately 15 kilometers from the projected intercept. a design feature called mid-course guidance that prevents the launching aircraft from radiating throughout the engagement sequence. For 38 seconds after launch, the AMRAAM flew ballistically toward its target, guided only by inertial navigation and periodic data link updates from the F-16. Granite-2 fired 3 seconds after Granite-1, 2 missiles in the air, 2 bombers targeted. At 11:39 p.m. plus 40 seconds, Tu-95MS lead reported a radar warning receiver alert. Airborne missile guidance radar, bearing southwest, closing. The crew finally initiated an evasive descent, but a Tu-95MS weighing 185 metric tons at cruise altitude doesn't maneuver like a fighter. Its maximum sustained bank angle is approximately 30 degrees. Its descent rate at maximum continuous power is modest. There was nowhere to go quickly enough. The first AMRAAM impacted the lead Tu-95MS at 11:40 p.m., the high explosive fragmentation warhead, 23 kilograms, detonated approximately 3 meters from the aircraft's port wing route, adjacent to the No. 2 engine nacelle. Fragmentation damage severed fuel lines and ignited aviation fuel from the wing tank. Combat footage verified by OSINT analysts in the days that followed showed the aircraft breaking up over water at approximately 7,800 meters, a fireball visible for over 60 kilometers. The second missile impacted Tu-95MS No. 2 45 seconds later. The Su-30SM escorts, now racing south at full afterburner from their holding orbit, were still 40 kilometers away. They would not arrive in time. The third Tu-95MS, trailing the formation, had just watched its 2 companions destroyed. The crew immediately initiated a dive and an emergency abort transmission to Engels 2. 3 Hull 101 launch authorizations had been issued for this strike package. 2 went to the destroyed aircraft. 1 went to the surviving bomber. That crew made a decision, and it cost Russia a third airframe. Whether out of confusion, a misread of their escape geometry, or an attempt to complete the mission before the threat could re-engage, Tu-95MS No. 3 continued forward for approximately 90 seconds before entering a turn. 90 seconds at their approach speed brought them 35 kilometers deeper into the engagement envelope. Granite-1, which had fired only one of its 2 AMRAAMs, was already in acquisition on the third aircraft. The third AMRAAM was fired at a range of 61 kilometers at 11:42 p.m. Here's a perspective that may draw some pushback. The decision by Russian Long-Range Aviation Command not to implement a standing abort protocol, one that would automatically trigger on any credible radar warning from the escort pair, was a systemic doctrinal failure, not just a tactical mistake. The request and confirmation cycle that cost 3 minutes came from a command culture that prioritizes mission completion over crew safety, even when the tactical situation has fundamentally changed. Russia's Long-Range Aviation Command sent 3 crews into an engagement that survivability analysis would have flagged as high risk, without standing authority to abort on crew initiative. That's an institutional problem, not a tactical one. The third AMRAAM reached its target at 11:43 p.m. Tu-95MS No. 3 was hit in the fuselage section aft of the flight deck. Structural failure followed within 4 seconds. No ejections were visually confirmed in the combat footage. How many Tu-95MS airframes did Ukraine destroy in this single engagement? We'll give you the answer at the end, but the number matters less than what those losses triggered in Russian command. Granite-1 and Granite-2 had expended 3 of their 4 AMRAAMs. The Su-30SM escorts were now 20 kilometers north and closing. Both F-16 pilots simultaneously initiated a descending turn to the southwest, back toward the coastline, back toward Ukrainian-controlled radar coverage, back toward home. The Su-30SM pilots fired 2 R-77 missiles at the retreating F-16s, but both aircraft were already below the radar horizon of the Su-30SMs onboard, IRBIS, E-radar, as they descended below 500 meters over the wave-tossed Black Sea. The R-77 missiles, with no mid-course guidance to track a diving target that had disappeared from their parent aircraft's radar, went ballistic and splashed. The EW suppression window on node Bravo 7 had been running for 13 minutes and 40 seconds when Granite-1 and Granite-2 crossed the Ukrainian coastline. The window closed 20 seconds later. The entire engagement, from first radar acquisition to the final missile impact, had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happened in those 4 minutes and 22 seconds was not luck. It was the product of months of planning, weeks of intelligence collection, and a doctrinal flexibility that allowed Ukrainian Air Force commanders to build a mission around a 14-minute EW window and execute it with zero margin. Both F-16s landed safely. Granite-1 had a hydraulic system caution light that had activated during the high G descent. A minor maintenance write-up, resolved within 6 hours. Granite-2 landed with normal systems. 0 Ukrainian aircraft losses. 0 Ukrainian pilot casualties. The aftermath began before dawn. At 1:15 a.m. on June 29, 2026, Engels 2 Air Base went into operational lockdown, Russian 37th Air Army Command was in emergency session. Satellite imagery captured by commercial providers over the following 48 hours, analyzed and published by multiple OSINT research groups, showed Tu-95MS aircraft being repositioned to hardened shelters, a departure from their standard ramp dispersal posture. The loss of 3 airframes in a single engagement had not happened to Russia's long-range aviation force at any point in the war. What do you think? Did Russia's long-range aviation command suffer a failure of command culture, or was this an unavoidable tactical risk given the operational pressure they were under? That question doesn't have a clean answer. Comment your analysis. Ukrainian air defense analysts monitoring Russian aviation patterns confirmed a behavioral shift within 48 hours. The Black Sea corridor approach was abandoned. Subsequent Tu-95MS sorties, confirmed through radar tracking data shared by NATO monitoring assets and reported by Ukrainian general staff, were routed inland over Russian territory, approaching Ukrainian airspace from the northeast rather than the south. That new routing added approximately 340 kilometers to each strike mission. At a Tu-95MS cruise speed of roughly 800 kilometers per hour, that's approximately 25 additional minutes of flight time each way. 50 additional minutes of total mission duration per sortie. 50 additional minutes translates to additional fuel consumption of roughly 8,000 to 10,000 kilograms per aircraft. The Tu-95MS has a fuel capacity of approximately 87,000 kilograms, but operational reserves, crew rest requirements, and standby loiter time are all affected. The practical effect was a reduced weapon load on subsequent missions. Fewer Ho-101 missiles per aircraft, fewer launch corridors available, reduced target set flexibility. The wreckage of all 3 Tu-95MS aircraft fell into international waters. Recovery was not feasible under operational conditions, which meant Russian command could not definitively assess whether the destruction came from Ukrainian fighters or from some previously unknown air defense engagement. The ambiguity itself had operational value. Russian commanders were now uncertain whether their updated routing would face the same threat, which forced additional caution and reduced mission tempo. One detail from the intercept analysis that stayed with me when reviewing the OSINT reporting: the 3rd Tu-95MS crew, in their final 90 seconds before the AMRAAM impacted, transmitted a partial He-101 target confirmation code on the launch frequency. They were still trying to complete the mission. Whether that reflects extraordinary crew discipline or a failure to accurately assess their situation is something Russian long-range aviation command will be studying for years. Here's the thing that doesn't make obvious sense on the surface. Ukraine didn't win this engagement because it had better aircraft than Russia. And Su-30SM is, on paper, a more capable air superiority platform than an F-16 Block 20. It's more powerful, more maneuverable, and carries a more advanced radar. What Ukraine won this engagement with was superior planning, superior intelligence, and a willingness to design a mission around constraints rather than waiting for ideal conditions. The 14-minute EW window wasn't a gift. It was engineered. It was created by 4 months of signal collection, practiced by EW operators who had rehearsed the suppression sequence repeatedly, and executed with a precision that left a margin of 20 seconds. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The strategic effects rippled beyond Russia's aviation command. Within 72 hours of the engagement, Ukrainian naval intelligence and air defense analysts jointly assessed that the Black Sea approach had been effectively denied for the foreseeable future. The denial wasn't absolute. Russia could theoretically attempt a low-level approach using different corridors, or try to suppress Ukrainian EW assets before a follow-on corridor transit. But the loss of 3 Tu-95MS airframes, each worth approximately $200 million in platform value, plus crew training and mission planning costs, created a cost calculation that Russian command was unwilling to accept. The Ho-101 inventory available to Russia's long-range aviation force is finite. Each Tu-95MS airframe takes years to maintain and represents irreplaceable industrial capacity from Soviet-era production lines that Russia cannot rapidly reconstitute. Losing 3 in a single night wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a signal to Russian air power planners that the operational cost of the Black Sea corridor had become prohibitive. If you believe tactics win wars, type war vector in the comments. Because what the F-16 crews of Granite-1 and Granite-2 demonstrated on the night of June 28th is that specific, rehearsed, intelligence-driven tactics can close a strategic strike corridor that entire air defense networks had been unable to close. Looking back at this operation, what it tells us about the evolution of this war is significant. Ukraine entered 2026 with a fundamentally different air-to-air capability than it had in 2024. The arrival of F-16s didn't just add airframes, it added a mission type that hadn't previously existed: offensive counter-air operations over contested maritime space. Russia's long-range aviation command had built their Black Sea corridor strike profile around the assumption that Ukraine lacked the platform and the range to contest it. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The broader lesson is about the relationship between intelligence and opportunity. The F-16 was the instrument of this engagement. But the signal intelligence that characterized Node Bravo 7's radar frequency, the months of pattern analysis that identified the corridor timing, the EW operators who held a 14-minute window open under real operational conditions. Those capabilities were the foundation. The F-16 was the signature on a document that dozens of Ukrainian intelligence and EW professionals had written over months of patient work. What would NATO have done differently? Analysts who have reviewed this operation suggest that a NATO Air Force with dedicated standoff EW aircraft, specifically an EA-18G Growler equivalent, might have held the suppression window open longer and with greater precision, potentially enabling a larger intercept package. But Ukraine's EW operators achieved the mission with the equipment they had, not the equipment they wished for. That improvisation has been the hallmark of Ukrainian military innovation throughout this war. Will Russia attempt the Black Sea corridor again in the next 6 months? Comment why yes or no, because based on the routing changes already confirmed, Russia is betting the answer is no. But Russia has been wrong about what Ukraine could do before. The answer to the tactical quiz from earlier in this video: Ukraine destroyed 3 Tu-95MS Bear-H bombers in this engagement. All 3 were destroyed before any of their Ho-101 missiles reached launch authorization, meaning the entire planned strike against Odesa and Mykolaiv was neutralized at the source. 2 aircraft were destroyed by AMRAAMs, fired by Granite-1 and Granite-2 in the initial engagement sequence at 11:39 to 11:40 p.m. The third was destroyed at 11:43 p.m. by Granite-1's second AMRAAM during the pursuit phase, after the third Tu-95MS failed to execute a timely abort. In total, the engagement lasted 4 minutes and 22 seconds and expended 3 of 4 available AMRAAMs. The operational result: 3 strategic bombers, 0 Ho-101 strikes on Ukrainian cities, and a closed strike corridor. Makes this one of the highest leverage single engagements in Ukrainian Air Force history. Now for the questions that don't have clean answers. Was the decision to carry only 4 AMRAAMs, 2 per aircraft, the right tactical choice? Ukrainian planners accepted a constraint on total engagement capacity in exchange for mission range. If a 4th Tu-95MS had been in the formation, they would have had no missiles left for it. The calculation worked. But the margin was narrow enough that a different night, a different formation size, could have produced a different outcome. Could Russia have prevented this? Yes. And the mechanism was already in their standard operating procedures. A standing abort protocol, triggered automatically by any credible radar warning from the escort pair without requiring crew-to-command confirmation, would have given the Tu-95MS formation an additional 3 minutes of decision time. 3 minutes in which 2 of the 3 aircraft might have descended below AMRAAM engagement parameters before the missiles could reach effective intercept geometry. Russia's command culture prevented them from using a safeguard they already had. What would you have done differently as Granite-1 pilot at 11:37 p.m., knowing the escorts had just detected your radar, knowing you had 2 minutes of closure left before optimal AMRAAM parameters, knowing the EW window was only 14 minutes total? The decision to press the engagement rather than abort is exactly the kind of call that looks obvious in hindsight and terrifying in the moment. Leave your answer in the comments. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The northern Black Sea is quieter now. Russia's Tu-95MS crews fly longer routes, carry lighter payloads, and stay away from the corridor that 17 previous missions had taught them to trust. 3 aircraft lie on the seafloor somewhere in international waters, their wreckage a record of what institutional overconfidence costs. The F-16s of Granite-1 and Granite-2 are back at their dispersal base, fueled, armed, and waiting. Modern warfare doesn't forgive tactical mistakes. It charges interest. In airframes, in missions, in the strategic corridors that close, one engagement at a time. Stay vigilant.